Welcome to Military Analytics. The violence of the war in Ukraine has reached such a level that the huge losses of Russians are now considered normal. The losses of Russian army include not only the soldiers who died, but also those who fled their troops and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. In particular, 10,000 Russian soldiers applied to the I Want to Live project, which was established by the Ukrainian government after the partial mobilization decision. And they are surrendering to the Ukrainian army by various methods. Some of the 300,000 Russian youth recruited by the partial mobilization decision announced in the autumn were sent to Ukraine. But 300 to 500 mobilized soldiers were eliminated by the Ukrainian army almost every day as the commanders kept demobilized soldiers on the front line. The vast majority of those who remained either laid down their weapons and surrendered to the Ukrainian army or fled from the front and went to mainland Russia on their own. So what did Ukraine do for deserters in the Russian army? The Ukrainian government has signed a project that will go down in history after the partial mobilization decision of Russian President Vladimir Putin. I Want to Live was launched as a Ukrainian state project designed to help Russian military personnel surrender safely. The aim is to ensure that the Russian soldiers fleeing their units are safely removed from the Ukrainian borders and reunited with their families. At this point, it is seen that I Want to Leave project has been carried on with success. A total of 10,500 people from the temporarily occupied regions of Russia and Ukraine applied to the I Want to Leave project for Russians ready to surrender. During the 6 months of the project, more than 40 million people, 84% of whom were users, visited the I Want to Leave website despite regular attempts by the Russian Federal Service for Communications, Information Technologies, and Mass Media Supervision to block access to project relatives and loved ones of the soldiers other than Russian soldiers applied to the phone line. Most of the time mobilized. Russians do not have access to the internet or mobile communication when they arrive in Ukraine, so their families use the I Want to Live line instead. The line I Want to Leave undoubtedly became one of the important turning points of the war as a project that saved the lives of Russian soldiers who did not want to fight in Ukraine. But there were also Russian soldiers who do not know the line I Want to Leave and still did not want to fight in Ukraine. These soldiers are surrendering to the Ukrainian forces one by one. The Luhansk Regional Administration said that 52 soldiers from Russia had surrendered in the Luhansk direction in the past few days. The surrendered Russian soldiers announced that the commander of the troops in Svatov Crimea direction was changed for the 4th time. Now the group is led by the officer who led the failed attack on Kiev. It was also reported that Ukrainian troops managed to stabilize the situation in Belogorivka. Now the units of the Ukrainian army settled there are successfully repelling Russian attacks in this direction. Just last week, the Ukrainian army managed to advance 2.5 kilometers in this direction. Considering the number of troops brought in by the Russian Federation, this is a pretty good result for the Ukrainian army. It was reported that Russians who had been mobilized in the Luhansk region before had refused to fight for a month despite the pressure and were isolated by the Russian army. About 90 Russian mobilizations refusing to return to the front lines were held for a month on the territory of the former children's camp Berezovka in the village of Makarovo in the Luhansk region. During the meeting with the relatives of the soldiers, they said that they were not given food or water and that Russian army was trying to break them physically and psychologically. The soldiers did not know what would happen to them. There were 88 of them and they endured to the end. Their papers are not returned and they are not taken, although they ask them to take them to the Rostov region. On the contrary, they apply all kinds of pressure to send the soldiers back to the front. Russia may not have adequately prepared its army at the beginning of the war. So last summer, the Russian army began to signal the attacks of the Russian army, slowed down its advance, came to a standstill, and news came from the front line that Russian soldiers had rebelled against their commanders or had taken their commanders hostage. So why did the army come to this? Russian President Vladimir Putin did not expect the Ukraine war to last this long. In his words, the war would be over in 2 weeks, and the Russian army prepared accordingly. Although the Russian army came to the front of Kiev in the first days of the war, the Russian troops were stunned, after which they encountered a strong resistance of the Ukrainian army. Afterwards, although the Russian army launched an attack on Ukrainian territory from the east and through the Crimea, these attacks came to a halt in the middle of summer as the army was unprepared. The Ukrainian army saw very well the paths of the Russian army, the soldiers and special forces of the Ukrainian army, equipped with Western weapons, trained in Western countries. Together with the latest technology, weapons of the West created wonders on the battlefield. Thus began the great offensive of Ukraine in autumn. After that, the motivations of the Russian soldiers collapsed. Afterwards, the loss of an important city like Kherson by the Russian army destroyed the morale of the army and the war effort. Although Putin blamed his commanders and dismissed them, the soldiers were unarmed, hungry, and lacking basic necessities. After that, desertions from the army began. The wife of a mobilized soldier said that after a 3-day exercise, the army was taken to Zmiivka to dig trenches, after which they were shot at in the Plashenka settlement, and a unit flat demobilized for 3 days lay on the field only with machine guns, without the ability to shoot. Then, by order of the commander, the soldiers returned to Zmiivka, but the commander ordered them to return to Plashenka. Most of the mobilized refused and wrote explanatory notes, after which they were disarmed and taken to the Berezovka camp. There they were threatened by military prosecutors and commanders and forced to sign a 3-year contract to remain in the army. The mothers and wives of those mobilized from Penza last fall had requested the military prosecutor's office to remove the men from the front. In their objections, they stated that their husbands and sons had been sent to the front without proper training. According to them, the survivors, after a massive bombardment by the armed forces of Ukraine, retreated to nearby settlements where they were captured by the military police and again sent under fire. The wives of the Russians mobilized from Vologda demanded that their loved ones who were sent to the front returned from hell. Earlier, Russian propagandists allegedly told mobilized soldiers dissatisfied with the lack of combat training before they were sent to the front that the army was to blame. Prior to this, Russian mobilized soldiers surrendered near Svardov. Most of the prisoners were from the Moscow region and the capital itself. The soldiers complained about the order that left them at the front for massacre. Relatives of those mobilized from the Voronezh, and those great losses. Among those mobilized near Svatava, one of the survivors of the bombardment of the contact line near Makivka in the Saratovsky district of the Luhansk region, spoke of the losses among the mobilized, which, according to preliminary information, could reach up to 600 people. It is difficult to predict what the coming days will show us about the Ukrainian war, but it seems that the Russian army will not be able to continue this war any longer as long as it suffers such losses. It seems that the main war motivation of the Ukrainian armed forces in recent days has been concentrated on Crimea. Ukrainian armed forces are trying to advance to the gates of Crimea with the breaches they opened in Zaporizhia and Melitopol against Putin's soldiers who are trying to concentrate the war on the Eastern Front. In addition to these, the recent intensification of airstrikes by the Ukrainian armed forces on the region has started to cause the Russian people to feel unsafe in the region. For this reason, the news that the Russian people have fled from the peninsula is increasing day by day. We will examine the subject in detail in our video. We will share the last-minute developments and instant reports in the region with you. And we will interpret the latest situation in Crimea together on the way to reach the most accurate information about current affairs and hot breaking points. In fact, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's pointing out Crimea as the main target of the war has revealed Putin's nightmares. Now, while the Russian army suffered heavy losses in the east of Ukraine, on the other hand, it started to struggle desperately to protect Crimea and its surroundings. Russia's reputation on the global stage was irreparably damaged, in particular by the October attack on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. The repeated attacks on the Sevastopol port in Crimea, the sinking of the Moskva flagship, and the overall military failure, especially for the past 40 days, it has become more evident that Ukraine can prepare for a major operation against Crimea. Last week, Ukrainian leader Zelensky promised to take back Crimea, and the U.S. administration stated that it would support Ukraine in every field. The USA actually announced that its own weapons could be used on Crimea after the successful conclusion of the Kherson offensive. This was actually the explanation that the Ukrainian armed forces had been waiting for as the U.S. seized Crimea as Ukrainian territory. It has become clear that superior U.S. weapons will assist the Ukrainian armed forces in hitting Russian targets in Crimea. Currently, Ukraine is adding powerful Western war systems to its inventory for an all-out offensive, In particular, Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 tanks, and the U.S. armored vehicles, and new HIMARS missiles with a range of 170 kilometers will be powerful components in a planned attack on Crimea as a result of these airstrikes targeting settlements such as Belbek, Saki, and Sevastopol. It has been proven once again that even very cheap UAVs can target Crimea. In the face of this striking result, the inhabitants of the peninsula panicked. Nearly 1 million Russian citizens were settled in Crimea in 8 years, but they now understand that Crimea is not Russia, and they are aware that the war has come to the strategic peninsula. After the heavy attacks on Crimea in August and September, Russian civilians in Crimea began to evacuate the peninsula en masse. Huge convoys formed on the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea and Russia. In Crimea, martial law and the state of emergency have been declared several times after the latest explosions and attacks in Crimea. Russian civilians no longer have any reason to stay there. To date, nearly 120,000 Russians have been evacuated or fled from Crimea. Now this number is increasing. The Tatar administration in Crimea predicts that at least 500,000 Russians will leave the peninsula if Ukraine launches a serious operation for Crimea. Even now, after the latest heavy airstrikes on Crimea, tens of thousands of Russian civilians there began to leave the peninsula by trains to Melitopol and from there to Mariupol via the sea line or by civilian vehicles on the Kerch Bridge. If you remember last week, Russia announced that the Kerch Bridge was reopened to traffic. Those who have the opportunity now seem to be slowly escaping with their vehicles over the Kerch Bridge to Russia, especially after August. The residents of the region and the Russian authorities in Crimea participated in this evacuation movement a lot. Moscow officials argue that escapes from the peninsula are not real. But every day, thousands of Russian civilians from the Crimea leave the peninsula based on satellite images and regional data provided by an independent international data company since August. This escape is intense. Contrary to what Russia claims, there is a basic reason for this. As we said at the beginning of the video, Ukraine can now take over Crimea. There is already loud talk that Ukraine could recapture the precious Crimean peninsula from Russia within months as we see Vladimir Putin's defenseless troops, forcing them to step back. Russia's heavy airstrikes on Ukraine after the Russian army in Crimea received devastating blows. One after another should be seen as another manifestation of the desperation in Crimea. So what are the routes that the Ukrainian armed forces have to go through in order to obtain Crimea? Ukraine can actually hold back Russia, although at a significant cost. Kiev they can focus on building a large armored force. Many steps have been taken for this. You will see an important move to help isolate the decisive region, the Crimea. Once they can take the Crimea, other things can wait and follow. A decisive blow would be to isolate Crimea. The Russian defense infrastructure in Crimea could be smashed once Ukraine has enough strength for a ground offensive. After this, with a strong ground operation, Crimea will fall into the hands of Ukraine in August. There are 2 roads connecting Crimea to the mainland, and if you can separate them with long-range fire, then Crimea increasingly looks like a trap. Then you can start hitting the very vulnerable Russian infrastructure on the Crimean Peninsula by going after the Russian headquarters and infrastructure. This will neutralize the Russian advantage. Ukraine was very wise to go after various headquarters, transport and ammunition storage facilities. When you start shooting at these, you really undermine Russia's ability to do anything. If Ukrainian forces get what they need in terms of long-range weapons and can assemble sufficiently armored formations, both Ukrainian, captive Russians and Western, they will have the combat power to take down what often appears to be long lines. This fighting force can also break through Putin's guard. There is still conflict between Russia and Ukraine on all fronts, but at the moment there is relative inactivity as both sides prepare major attacks in the coming weeks and possibly months. Russia is undoubtedly preparing for the second Kiev offensive. Ukraine is preparing itself for the Crimean offensive. Putin is mobilizing his forces, preparing to send them to Ukraine. Some are already there to give him the crucial support he needs more than he's ever had to smash the Ukrainian army. When this mobilization comes to an end, it will arguably be Putin's last bluff. In his gamble, Putin will put everything on the table and rest. To date, the Ukrainians have been hit hard, but so has Putin. Of course, if Putin fails to achieve this important victory, There could be a very bleak future for him, with the possibility of some kind of coup d'état against him in Russia. He will be very wary of this possibility. Despite this war, Putin is still in a very strong position and has a popularity within Russia. But we've also seen rumors from some elites in Russia. For example, the head of the Wagner Group, the probability of a popular Russian uprising against Putin is extremely low. But the likelihood that someone important or a significant number of people in Moscow will take action against him is possible. In the event of the loss of Crimea, the probability of this revolt would increase much more because when Putin annexed this peninsula in 2014, he advertised it and increased the value of the island in the eyes of the Russian people. He now realizes that losing it would be the end of him. But on the other hand, he's waiting for the right time to make his last move by opening a corridor, starting from the east and continuing to Kiev in order to win this war.
Today, there is a lot of news from the east here as Russians are trying to engulf the city as fast as possible. They increased the number of their assault units and started attacking in large numbers. However, Ukrainians left them only a narrow pathway for possible advances. So when Russians launched their attack, they got right into a devastating artillery trap. Last time I told you that Ukrainians conducted a rapid tank raid on Russian positions in and around the Industrial College and obliterated more than 6 buildings that Russians used as major fortifications. I also told you that in the aftermath of the raid, Russians incurred so many losses that they were spotted collecting the dead with huge wheelbarrows. The freshest reports indicate that Ukrainians are now conducting similar actions in the western part of the region. Russian forces decided to focus on the western edge for 4 reasons. First of all, this is where the most important roads are that Ukrainians are using for delivering supplies which Russians are trying to cut. Secondly, Ukrainians are using the western edge to protect Hromov and create crossfire, which is why a recent series of Russian attempts to take the village failed, even though they were attacking it up to 10 times per day. Thirdly, the residential area in this region consists of small houses, which is a much less formidable fortification that requires fewer losses to overcome. And lastly, the alternative, which is storming the so-called citadel area, is much worse. Not only does it consist of 10-story buildings where Ukrainians have prepared and equipped each and every floor for defense, but half of the ground in front of the citadel is empty. A Ukrainian fighter from the Adar battalion reported that the former military base is empty because it only had barracks which were completely destroyed by artillery fire. He added that Ukrainians support Russians in this region very rarely, and in such cases there is usually no more than 2 troops that are conducting reconnaissance due to the fact that the areas of Russian advancement are quite obvious and small Ukrainians can leverage it to inflict even more losses on Russians. As noted by fighters from the 1st Border Detachment and 93rd Mechanized Brigade, right now, Russians make much bigger attacks where each assault unit consists of at least 20 troops. Such a high concentration of troops makes Russians more susceptible to Ukrainian artillery fire. And this is exactly the main task of Ukrainian artillery right now. Ukrainian fighters ascended. Artillery strikes are devastating and successfully stop Russian advancement. After conducting intense shelling, Ukrainians made a limited counterattack to push Russians back. Russians are also actively using their artillery, and the intensity of artillery strikes made many Ukrainian soldiers doubt the claims of Prigozhin that the Wagner forces do not have enough shells. Some of them speculated that he said that just to attract attention to himself. In any case, after conducting a series of artillery strikes, Russians published a video of a destroyed Ukrainian armored personnel carrier and claimed that they killed the commander of the 127th Brigade. The Ukrainian side responded to this piece of news and officially stated that this is not true. A few days ago, the Ukrainian commander of the Eastern Group of Forces once again visited Bakhmut in order to personally evaluate the state of defense and decide whether it is still sensible to hold the western part of Bakhmut. Some speculate that he also needed to check on the preparation for the so-called surprise for Russians, especially as Ukrainians have been experimenting with controlled explosions. As you remember, one of the versions is that Ukrainians will make a huge series of explosions along the entire contact line before the withdrawal. Recently, Russians published a video of what they described as a failed, controlled explosion of the building. However, this building is located on the opposite end of the front line, which clearly suggests that Ukrainians are experimenting with loads before putting them to practice. Ukrainians also released the video showing the previously destroyed building on Krasinski Street from a different angle. This confirms my previous analysis of the situation and confirms that Ukrainians are still holding the southern line. Overall, Ukrainians assume strong positions in the high-rise buildings, leaving Russians with a very limited number of options, which is pushing around the industrial college or the outer edge of the city by forcing the Russians to attack along such narrow lines. Ukrainians blew Russians into a trap because they are immediately attacking the overpopulated sectors with artillery, inflicting disproportionately high losses. And Wagner's continue attacking in large numbers because they have been pushed by their command to symbolically finish the battle by the 9th of May.